Hello. Welcome to the second in the SouthTalks lecture series that we offer here at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture at the University of Mississippi in Oxford. My name is Katie McKee, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Southern Culture. We have a real treat today, but before we get started, we should thank the people who make this happen. Thanks first to Afton Thomas, who is the Associate Director of the Center in charge of programs, whose careful, thoughtful planning has made all of this possible, even in the era of a pandemic. Thank you to Kelly Spivey, whose lovely graphics we see advertising all of the SouthTalks last year and again this semester. And thanks to Rebecca Cleary, who pushes out all of this information so that all of you knew to come here and join us today. There is a pre-recorded talk between our two guests that you can see if you would like to, and many of you have probably already watched in anticipation of today. But even if you haven't or you want to watch it later, I think you will still get a lot out of today's conversation. We are really lucky today to have with us Maurice Carlos Ruffin, who is the author of the acclaimed novel We Cast a Shadow that was released last year, and earlier this year it came out in paperback. Most particularly, we are lucky to have Maurice with us because he is the Grisham Writer in Residence this year at the University of Mississippi and teaching classes to our students here. But as excited as I am to see Maurice, I'm equally excited to welcome to the Zoom screen Hilary Word, who is a 2020 master's graduate of the Southern Studies program here at the University of Mississippi. We were just recalling earlier that Hilary and I were discussing her thesis right before spring break, and I said, have a good break and I'll see you later. And I've never seen her in person again, but I've seen her a lot on the screen. Hilary wrote a great thesis that is called Post-Soul Speculation and Exploration of Afro-Southern Speculative Fiction that won the Sue Hart Prize here at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture for outstanding work at the intersection of gender studies and Southern studies. So Hilary, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. McKee, for those wonderful introductions. I'm so glad that we're able to have this conversation. So thank you to the Center for the Study of Southern Culture for giving us this space to have these discussions and to continue from our previous discussion that, as Dr. McKee said, is now posted on YouTube on the Center's YouTube page. So you can go check that out later. And so, yeah, I'm really happy to continue this sort of question and answer portion, not just between Professor Ruffin and myself, but also taking questions from the viewers. And so we're just really glad that everyone is participating and, you know, let's begin. How are you? Oh, I think you're on mute.
There we go.
All right, cool.
So I was gonna say thanks to the university and thank you, Hilary, for having me. Thank you to Afton, thank you to Katie. This is very exciting to be involved in this program today because if you haven't seen the talk on video, you should go back and have a look at it because Hilary had some amazing questions, which now I'm nervous, like how I'm gonna respond to these questions live, but we'll see how it goes.
Thank you for that wonderful compliment. I don't know about amazing, but thank you. And you gave great answers, and I know you're gonna give great answers today. So for everyone who's viewing right now, I just like to call attention very quickly to the message that Afton put in the chat box. So, you know, if you all have questions, please feel free throughout the talk to drop your questions in the Q&A box, and I will happily ask them as we, you know, go along through the discussion. So just to sort of warm us up and to bring in folks who may not have had a chance to watch our previous discussion, and for people who just may not be familiar with your work, I was hoping if you wouldn't mind briefly explaining again what We Cast a Shadow is really about at its core for you, and also what the creative process was like for you in writing this novel.
Yeah, so I always bring visual aids. So I do have copies of my book. These are the two versions.
Well,
oh, great. The hardcover
Yeah.
And this is paperback that came out this year. And We Cast a Shadow. The elevator pitch that I gave when I sold it is that this is a book about the African-American attorney, 50 years in the future in an unnamed southern city. He is married, his wife is white, he has a mixed race child who can pass for white. And the dad is really obsessed with trying to protect his son from racism and white supremacy. And so he's kind of happy that this kid can pass for white, except he has a birthmark on his face that's been getting bigger and darker as he gets older. And that's sort of freaking the dad out. He's thinking about the implications of what that's going to mean for his son's future. So, very much in writing the book, I was thinking about, all of the killings, all the murders, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, even people who hadn't been killed yet, ironically, because I kept thinking this is going to keep happening. So we have Breonna Taylor. We have everything's happened this year with George Floyd and other people like that, Ahmaud Arbery. So it came out of that, and it came out of reading other thinkers like, Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, was influential. Certainly everything I was hearing from Roxanne Gay, Toni Morrison, you named them. So I was just sort of absorbing that. And in writing the book, it was a process of love, not a labor of love. I enjoy writing. And when I'm doing something that I'm really interested in, it's fun for me. And so even though it was a sort of dark topic, I kept thinking I wanted to create like Ralph Ellison had created in the past, or like Zora Neale Hurston had created in the past. I wanted to create or recreate the experience of being a Black person in America so that Black folks could see ourselves and kind of go, I thought I was crazy, but I'm not crazy. And I also wanted people who are not Black to read it and go, oh, wow, I didn't quite understand that it was that's what they were saying to us all the time. So those experiences together were sort of the reasons that I decided to write this book the way I wrote it.
Cool. Love that. And I remember in our previous discussion, you had talked about how you thought sort of the dystopian piece, the categorization of the book as sort of dystopian, is one way that makes it easier for a lot of people to sort of digest it and what you're talking about. So could you speak to that portion again? Because, when we think about dystopia, and I think how a lot of people would define it is sort of dystopian fiction is fiction where the society within the story is very, very sort of undesirable based on the author's own sort of ethics, or it's a society in decline. And it tends to be paired up with sort of post-apocalyptic fiction or apocalyptic fiction. And people tend to sort of have futuristic elements. But the reality is for a lot of people, dystopia is their contemporary sort of state of being. And so again, I was just wondering if you could talk to that portion of our previous discussion where you had mentioned that dystopia was sort of a modality that made these types of stories about violence and anti-Blackness easier for a lot of people to digest.
Yeah, I think that dystopia in my mind is taking reality for somebody who's having the worst experience in that culture, or for a group of people, for a community of people. Mm-hmm. So if you read a book or watch the TV show Handmaid's Tale, there is some woman or some women in society who think of themselves as being in this position of not having control over their reproductive rights, of being oppressed by certain men in the patriarchy, of just feeling like they're on the wrong side of the equation. Hunger Games, people who feel like they're being oppressed by a government that has too much control over their lives, people who feel like they should have the freedom to express themselves and to be free and to live and not be attacked. Those ideas for me are very similar to the idea of being a Black man, walking into a store and seeing the shopkeeper watch my movements as I go around the store. And so for many of my other friends and colleagues, they don't understand that experience. It's hard to sort of put that on themselves. So by giving it this sort of dystopian cast, I can say, all right, well, let me just give you a hypothetical Black man who's experiencing these things and see how you respond to that. And, I think I mentioned in the previous talk, this feeling of a few commentators saying, oh, things are kind of over the top here. Things are not that crazy in America. And yet this year, nobody said that. The comments that I've been seeing from people have not been along the lines of, how can we take it this far? I mean, if anything, the George Floyd killing and the reaction of the entire world shows you that people have decided that we have already gone too far. And so my book is definitely tied into that feeling of, if you pay attention, you'll see these things. If you see these things, you can change these things.
Love that. And I love also that your book is set in the South. Obviously, this is Southern Studies. And We Cast a Shadow is set in a major Southern city that's based on New Orleans, which you'll notice if you pay attention to certain cultural markers that are sort of located throughout the text in the near future. And so I wanted you to sort of speak to this this notion that the South is just a setting that is really ripe for speculative storytelling, whether that be through the already really established tradition of Southern Gothic fiction or other forms of speculative fiction like the one you're utilizing, dystopia. And why do you think dystopia or speculative fiction more broadly is such a necessary or valuable modality for Southern storytelling in particular?
Yeah, the South does have something to say, to take that old saying, about race in America. And I think that, I'll preface this by saying that we often unfairly act as if racism is only in the South or is so much worse in the South than it is in other places, where either it's not the case. At the same time, I think the South is a good place to sort of take particular details and try and parse them out. So, one example, I'm not from Oxford. I'm here right now. I'm staying in the Grisham house. It's a wonderful experience. And I've visited here a few times in the past, but, just being an observer, a new observer to this town, I'm just sort of looking at how the dynamics play out. I'm from New Orleans, which is a majority Black city, just like Atlanta and a few other American cities. So here I see, all right, it's not majority Black, fine. Most cities are not majority Black. But then I kind of go, well, where are the Black folks here? So I'm just riding around town, and I noticed that if I go up Molly Bar Road, I'll see this one little enclave, these projects. They're government-owned buildings where most of the Black folks are living at. And so I can't just sort of fly off the handle and make a judgment immediately and kind of go, oh, that's wrong and that's bad. But I can't ask questions about that. And so I just feel like in the South, there are a lot of things that exist in front of our faces that are sort of markers of inequality or markers of some history that's ongoing. And I just wonder, why is the case? I mean, I could go even farther and say that I've been in Southern towns that are sundown towns where there are no Black people. And you have to say, okay, something happened here 100 years ago or whatever that caused Black folks to not be in this town. And then there are other places where I'll go. Maybe Oxford is one example. I know Selma's one example where you go, all right, clearly a portion of the Black population left this little town years ago to go up north. Here are the people who stayed in this town. Why did they stay? Was it out of stubbornness? Was it out of a feeling of being trapped? Was it out of a feeling of we want to make things better for ourselves and our family and be a part of the community? So the South has, I think, as a writer and as a creator, you're trying to find emblematic things to build off of. And the South is just so ripe of history that comes out. A lot of the Northern stories are hidden because people in the North don't like to say things out loud. They won't talk about it, either on both sides of the equation. Things are happening sort of behind closed doors, whereas in the South, at some point, somebody's going to say something. But maybe it's Bubba, maybe it's Jerome. They're just going to say it out loud. You're kind of go, you shouldn't have said that, Jerome. But at least they said it. So I think the South has a certain level of courage in that, even though some of the choices are not the right choices. That courage is what allows, for example, Mississippi to change its state flag. People just talking about it, saying it out loud for decades and decades and decades to finally go, you know what? We can have a better flag. And it happens. And it's shocking, but it's only shocking if you're not paying attention to the conversations that are happening. And the South is actually very good at that. And I see my book as part of that conversation.
South is good at holding. I like that. And I like the idea of a sort of courage that you say that the South sort of holds and that people are at least willing to talk about certain things. And so that makes me, when I think of this idea about courage, that makes me want to go a little bit more specifically into the book now and thinking about demelanization, whether the sort of courage to actually go through the procedures or the courage to not sort of cave in and go through the procedures. So we know demelanization is a really important feature within the world of We Cast a Shadow. We see how the readers see how the narrator like dramatically shapes his life around the pursuit of the full demelanization process for his son Nigel. And so again, for those who are not familiar with the work, I want you to explain like what is demelonization in the context of the novel, but also what made you want to feature it so prominently within the novel, and what do you see its contribution to the novel's, how do you see demelonization's relationship to the novel's categorization as dystopian, or to the dystopian elements within the novel?
Well, the thing about it is that in society tries to pick winners and losers. I mean, it's a silly example, but it's a real example. So we have the movie Mulan, for example. Mulan is an ancient Chinese story about, Ba Mulan, who is this young girl who decides to take her father's place in the emperor's army in order to, fight as a man. And in that story, this girl decides to pose as a man, because in that society, men have certain rights, certain responsibilities, and a certain amount of honor that they can get as a result of their manhood. Mm-hmm. Now, the same thing exists with Blackness. Blackness is a sort of token in America. You see a Black person and you basically say, okay, if somebody is white, their value is $100. If they're Black, discounted by 30 cents or, $30 or whatever, right? So you're saying, what you're saying is that in a capitalist society where everything is pegged to a certain value, anybody who's seen as less than has a problem. They will have problems with police officers. They have problems when they go into stores. They have problems in schools. They have problems in hospitals. And so in my novel, where this is expanded, it's gotten more powerful, and the effect is more pronounced, some folks are deciding, hey, you know what? We should change our skin colors, that we look like white people. We should change our noses, change our lips, change other features on our body, our hair, in order to fit in. And of course, it's not the most bizarre thing. I mean, if you look at Michael Jackson 1975 versus Michael Jackson 1995, he basically changed race, whether it was because of his vitiligo or not. He was not the same physically appearing person as he was. And it's the same thing for many other people throughout the history of American society. And of course, even beyond that, people who could just pass, they were Black, but they would just sort of play out the fact that, no, I'm actually, a white person. So in the dystopian context, it's a fine line, because people have called the book satirical sometimes. And in my mind, I think the only thing that makes it satirical is that the average parent, even in the worst circumstance, would not want to make that kind of a change to their child. It wouldn't be something taken lightly. Like, oh, kid, I can make you white to make you safe. So I think in a dystopian society, and again, that is any society in which certain people are marginalized, they can't even breathe, basically. In those situations, you're forced to take drastic actions. And the demelonization procedures is an example of that. It's kind of like, well, what else can you do for yourself? You can go out and protest, but maybe it'll be ineffective or you get hurt. You can try and just ignore it, but if you ignore it, it'll keep on just, sort of nipping at your heels and biting you and then swallow you whole eventually. Or you can actually take this action that is a sort of complete change. If capitalism is like a religion, it's like a religious conversion. You're saying, I want to go from one spot to the other spot, so you can no longer look at me as less than. I am worth $100 now, and therefore I can walk to the door of the police station and ask for charges to be pressed, and you won't arrest me instead of arresting the actual perpetrator. So those things are all tied into this idea of wanting to be able to live as a full person. And I think that the lead character's mentality makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, you can do things that make a lot of sense that are also damaging, because the system is requiring you to make these bad choices, like he's being required to make bad choices in the book.
Definitely. Really harmful choices we see throughout the novel, that the narrator really has no qualms about harming himself, Nigel, and other people, especially people from his old neighborhood, the Tico. He has no issue sort of exploiting any of those folks, if it means eventually getting Nigel that surgery or those procedures done. And I think something that's really interesting to me about the demelonization piece in the novel, it's supposed to be, it's not just, so it's far reaching, right? Like, we know it goes down sort of to the cellular level. That's what happens. But also it can be genetic now. Like, people who undergo the full procedure, their children no longer have to worry about being Black or possibly looking racially ambiguous or whatever. And so seeing that sort of extremity was, yeah, it was really eye-opening. But also, I kind of, this is sort of a smaller tidbit. It was really interesting to me that you had sort of the creator or perfecter of the demelanization procedure be a dark-skinned Nigerian woman, Dr. Nzinga. What informed that choice, that decision?
Yeah, well, so two things there. I mean, certainly if you look at a group of people and you say, hey, if you change the thing about you that we don't like, you change it permanently, even so that your children will be born without those traits, that's genocide, is what it is. You know, if you're saying we're just going to erase Blackness from society, that's what that is. So I was thinking about that very directly, about how it's been done to so many people throughout history, whether it's, you know, certainly Black folks, but also Jewish people, Romani, the Rohingya, and I name many of these groups in the book at certain points, just thinking about how people have treated the other in societies. With Dr. Nzinga, you know, often when I'm writing, I try to find a way to, I guess, be provocative, but also be unexpected. And so it would have been very easy to have a doctor who made this demelanization process, wants to stop Blackness from existing, be like a white country guy named Joe. You know, he's just kind of like, come on in, we'll get you straightened out. You know, like this, there's actually a guy like that in that old film Blade Runner. The main scientist who makes these androids is like a country guy, which is amazing to me. He has this really thick, like Tennessee accent. But I kept thinking about the fact that, you know, racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, is a worldwide issue. And you would think that, okay, well, you know, Africa, you know, it's the continent that created humans. You know, that's where we're all from, that we'd have some safety there. But in my research, I found that, you know, skin lightening creams, for example, you know, skin bleaching creams are $1 billion industry in Africa. And so I thought, okay, well, they would have the motivation and recipe in Africa to want to make these changes. And so I just brought her over to America because that's where all the money's at. And you bring it to this particular city, which is like a focal point for a lot of these issues in my book. And it just kind of added up to me. And I also thought about how sometimes even somebody who you think would be your ally can be your worst enemy. So there actually is a historical queen Nzinga. And the story I heard about her was that she was very powerful, very intelligent, brilliant. When the Europeans came to her tribe, they thought she was just like some savage, basically. And she could recognize immediately, like in their faces, oh, they don't respect me. And so they had like all the European finery, and the explorer who came in, like brought his own throne to sit on. So his guys brought in a throne for him to sit down on. And she's looking around like, we don't use thrones in my tribe. So then she commands one of her subjects to kneel on all fours so she can sit on him. So she sits on him. And that stuck with me because it's this idea of, all right, you want to present a certain way to these people you're trying to impress, but you're also sort of like messing over your own subjects to do that. And so something about that like triggered that thought in my mind about how she would fit into this book.
Okay, I love that's interesting, for real. Okay, so we actually have our first audience question. So the question is, who are some of your major literary influences, and who would you say are some of the ones to watch in contemporary fiction?
Oh, those are great questions. Well, I mean, many influences. I mean, and it's kind of hard to break down because you can divide between like the people you read growing up, you know, the people you read like in college, the people you read when you were just like trying to have a good time and read some interesting books, and people that influenced the work itself. People who influenced the work itself, I think, would be people like I mentioned, Ralph Ellison, definitely Richard Wright with Native Son. You know, any Toni Morrison, but definitely Sula and Bluest Eye in particular. I mentioned Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. If I had not read that book, I probably would not have had this very intense father-son relationship, which is where that comes from in my book. I mentioned Zora Neale Hurston, absolutely. Nathaniel Hawthorne with his short story called The Birthmark, which is about a guy meets this pretty girl and like decides that he thinks she is the most beautiful person in the world, but he wants to get rid of her birthmark. So similar concept there. From like 170 years ago. Melville and how he sees people and humanity as these sort of groups interact with each other. And oddly enough, some books that I never actually read, but I must have known what like something about them, like spiritually. So like George Schuyler's Black No More, which is about a man in the 1930s in New York. And in that society, Black folks are considering going through surgery to be white. Middle Passage by Charles Johnson, which I hadn't read when it came out. And this won the Pulitzer in the 90s. And it's basically Moby Dick told from the perspective of the one Black character who's like ignored in the original book. So there's that whole deal right there. And then contemporary writers. I mean, there's so many amazing people that I just love and respect. There's my good friend Sarah Broom, who wrote The Yellow House. She won the National Book Award last year. I could name Morgan Parker, the poet over in California. She's wonderful. Mira Jacob is a great graphic novelist who talks about and draws about race from the perspective of being an Indian American person. Brandon Taylor, he's up for a Booker Prize right now. Great writer. Deshaun Charles Watson is like my brother. Love him so much. He has a book called In West Mills, which is a great book. And a couple others I think about. My good friend Tiara Jones, who writes these big, bright, just like very contemporary books that I love so much. She's been around for years.
Yeah.
American Marriage. It was actually a book, Oprah Book Club pick last year, but 2 years ago now. She's fantastic. And of course, I got to name the hometown dude, Kiese Lehman, who in so many ways has been instrumental in my own growth. I met him probably 4 or 5 years ago, and he was just like, I mean, we all know he's just a great person. He was just inspirational to me, like on a personal basis, and in reading his work, gave me a lot of sort of strength and power to move forward in my work.
Yes, that's a good list. And so we've talked about the literary influences, but now we have another audience question that's related to sort of TV and film. So it says, thanks for this, Hilary and Maurice. I'm wondering how y'all feel about some of the recent attempts in TV and film to capture the Black South in ways that seem more expansive than in years past. Thinking P-Valley, Greenleaf, Uncorked on Netflix, Queen Sugar, Lovecraft Country, Watchmen. Okay. Well, I'm going to be honest and say I have actually not watched Lovecraft Country, and I have not watched Uncorked either, so I cannot offer commentary on that. P-Valley, I was excited for because Mississippi, and it's set in a small town in Mississippi, primarily in a strip club. And I thought it was interesting for the show to feature like sex workers in contemporary small town South. And so, I've only watched the first episode actually, but I'm excited to like keep going. Queen Sugar, I love Queen Sugar. I mean, there's a lot of like dramatics and theatrics or whatever, but I love that, again, it's small town, deep South, and these siblings are navigating in some of these complicated relationships and trying to figure out how to move on after their father's death. I'm just really excited for stories that talk about the contemporary deep South outside of like Atlanta and Houston, There's and New Orleans. I feel like New Orleans gets a weird, well, not weird. All of the speculative stuff that people feel about the South really gets layered onto New Orleans and like stacked up in ways that sometimes romanticize the city, I think, to the detriment of folks who still live there, especially the poor and working class people who still live there. But Queen Sugar takes place in a smaller town in Louisiana. So I like that. I like Greenleaf too. Again, Greenleaf is set in Memphis, contemporary Memphis, and explores sort of side of African-American religiosity that sometimes people sort of make fun of, but I think Greenleaf tries to complicate that a little bit and show really all the politics and sort of the drama that goes on in a lot of these Black Southern church spaces. And, Memphis is really like an extension of Mississippi, if we're being honest. So a lot of it felt very familiar. But I mean, what do you think?
I saw a map, somebody on Twitter like renamed all the states in the South. And so like there was only one state, and it's Mississippi. But then the other states around it had like adjectives. So like Louisiana was like French Mississippi. And
Oh, wow.
Tennessee was like Hilly, Mississippi, and yada, 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 yada. So yeah, totally. And that's a good point you made, Hilary, about New Orleans, because the main thing with stories about New Orleans, particularly if the ones that try to focus on Black folks, is that none of them have been made by Black people, not recently anyway. It's always like this romanticized version that look, Treme had a lot of strengths, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a show set in the South, but it was made by David Simon, who was a genius. But his staff was not like Black writers. It was like just like 4 white guys and a woman, I think. And he had like 1 Black writer, but his parts were like very sort of constrained. And it raises a lot of questions because it's like, well, what are we entitled to for our existence as Black Southerners? Because, you know, in the 90s, we had like nothing. Like I can recall being a 90s like teenager and college person and turning on TV and having like In Living Color. You know, I think we still had Different World and some other shows, but those shows were kind of broad and they were always set up north somewhere or like in the Northeast. And that's all there was to it. And then like for most of the 2000s, you kind of only had Tyler Perry, who's so complicated for a lot of reasons. Now I give the brother credit because he's doing that thing for the people. That's why he's so popular amongst a certain, you know, part of the community. But in the past like 3 or 4 years, all these things that we have listed are giving us a broader range. Now, I've only seen extensively Watchmen, the TV show, mm-hmm. and Queen Sugar. I've seen some Greenleaf. I have not watched P-Valley, and I'm waiting to watch Lovecraft till it's over so I can like binge the entire thing at one time. Mm-hmm. But like I will say that, like with Watchmen, for example, I was skeptical because I knew the source material. It was like very sort of like aggro white British dude wrote it. There's like no race in it whatsoever. I'm like, what's going on? But that was an example of like the best outcome given the limitations of it. It was mostly white staff, like 1 brother, or maybe 2 brothers. And they did a very, very, very good job. Like episode 6 to me is like the best thing I saw last year. I'm like, you know what, that whole flashback scene, like the grandfather, seeing Regina King, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I could watch it over and over and over again. And it was very cathartic for me as a Black man, just seeing like this history played out and showing the contributions of the Black characters in the past that had been papered over. With Queen Sugar, I love it because to me, it's kind of hitting that same Tyler Perry range, but without being like farcical. It's like, yo, this is some Black of the country, and this is what the lives are like. It's kind of dramatic sometimes, but that's fine. I mean, there's a lot of white shows that were dramatic like that, Brothers and Sisters, and This Is Us, and yada, 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 right? So I do feel good that we are seeing more of these shows come out. I think the main thing is we need to make sure that the creators, particularly the showrunners, beyond anything else, are people of color, women of color, Black folks in particular, because what happens is, like with Lovecraft Country, and I have not seen it yet, so I can't talk too much about it. I know the source material is by a white dude, which is similar to the whole Watchmen setup. I know little about who's making it right now into the show and how that has worked. Mm-hmm. But I know, for example, you know what, it's funny you asked this question. My wife and I are watching a show right now called, it's set in Alabama, Heart of Dixie.
Oh,
like this,
yeah.
This super light romantic show.
Yeah.
This woman moves from New York. She's white. She's like a doctor in New York. She moves back to Alabama, and like this whole like
self, right? Yeah.
Yes. And so there's a bunch of Black characters on that show. There's like the brother who winds up playing Black Lightning eventually a few years later. There's Steve Urkel's dad is on the show, and like a few other Black characters. But what's so bizarre about it is I can just feel that there's no Black writers in the room, because there's never any acknowledgement of any sort of tension between races based upon like expectations, based upon like economics, based upon like background. And one of the biggest signals of that to me is none of the Black characters that I can tell have any family. Like the white characters have like brothers and sisters and dads and moms, and they're getting married, yada, yada, yada. But the 2 or 3 major Black characters, they only have a being in relation to the white characters. Like they're so-and-so's best friend, or they're so-and-so's boyfriend. And so that's just telling me that they can't imagine beyond the space of the white writers in the room. And so I'm hopeful, but I was hopeful in the 90s also. And I know how fast things can sort of get turned back very quickly. And so I want more, I want bigger, I want some Black women, I want some Black men, I want some non-binary people. Black folks making these shows, and that's going to give us the real diversity to get these stories told in ways that are not destructive or dishonest, because it's the dishonesty or it's the failure to recognize the truth of these stories that makes me get nervous and kind of just get like mad when I see them. But that's his own thing.
I think what I want for more stories about Black Southerners, especially rural and small town Black Southerners, is I want there to be care. I want their stories to be handled with care. And I want them at the center of the stories. Mm. I think that's what it is for me. I want them to be centered, and I want the stories to be handled with care. That doesn't mean romanticizing sort of the toxicity that does exist in some of these rural spaces. And that doesn't mean ignoring the very real trauma that comes with being like a working class Southerner. But like, I don't want our people to constantly be, dehumanized in these depictions. I want there to be care to the story, and I want our folks front and center, but
Hilary, that's such a wonderful way of putting it. Care is the operative word here, because what happens is if you don't have Black writers in the room, everything gets extreme. It's like either like everybody's suffering to the extent where it's like, oh my goodness, like it's the reason why I really can't watch The Wire. Like I know it's the greatest show of all time, but I also know that was not a Black writers room, because everybody is either on drugs, they're breaking all the laws, and there's never a moment like just sitting down where it's like, oh, here's a Black mother and a Black father with a Black child, just like having a conversation. It's always, what's the next crime being committed? Who's gonna get shot next in the face? Who's gonna beat so and so up? It's like, okay, that happens, but it's not all that happens. It's as if the stereotypes become the center of the story, and that's just not how it works for anybody. There's no community that is only the stereotypes. And so when you have those Black creators, if they're any good, they're going to write real experiences, and that is about care. It's about taking a moment to slow down and just have a story. That's a story,
Mm-hmm. Care. Yeah, I think, care is the biggest thing for me. And as you sort of alluded to, not even all Black creators can handle these stories with care. I'm gonna be honest. I feel real about like non-Black Mississippians writing about Black Mississippians. Like, not to say that a person from, born and raised in New York City couldn't like handle a story with care.
New York City.
But like, I do know there's a way that, depending on like class and geography, that people like consume like Black rurality. And sometimes, and you can be a Black person who comes from Black rural people, but you weren't raised around Black rural people. And you will look at us in a weird kind of frame of mind. So I think really the willingness to step outside of ego and the willingness to just handle things with care are the biggest things for me. And so this was a really great question to, I'm going to shout this person out, Dr. Foster, who was actually one of my professors when I was doing my Southern Studies Master's. So good to see you, and thank you for the question. But this makes me want to think about sort of just, when we talk about storytelling and stuff, you think about imagination. And so I want to sort of talk about the relationship between imagination and dystopia within the context of the novel. Specifically, I want us to talk about how in this story, how dystopia restricts, expands, or even like fosters just the ability to imagine completely new realities. I mean, we see how the narrator, he imagines that Nigel's life will be easier, and that he'll be happier if he's able to get these demelonization procedures for him. But, that's such a narrow vision, or that speaks to such a narrow sort of imagination of what happiness can look like, because we know that, again, the narrator is willing to harm himself, Nigel, and any other number of people to make sure that that becomes a reality. And so he can't imagine happiness within this white supremacist and capitalist framework. He can't imagine happiness without it. And achieving happiness within that context means harming somebody. However, on the other hand, Nigel and Araminta sort of completely divest from sort of the narrator and societal expectations of happiness within a white supremacist and capitalist framework. They completely discard that and say, we're going to live in this commune called New Rosewood in rural Appalachia. And we're going to imagine a completely new reality of what happiness can look like. That's not just as good as what's in the city, but is actually even better. So again, I'm curious as to what you think the relationship between imagination and dystopia and how it's restricted or fostered or expanded. Like what do you see those dynamics as?
Yeah, so those are great thoughts, especially about Nigel and Araminta and sort of founding this new society that's better than what came before it. So the writer who wrote Ender's Game, I can't recall his name right now, but he was talking about the difference between science fiction and fantasy. And it's an old definition, but the idea is that fantasy is fantasy. There you go, Orson Scott Card. Thank you very much in the comments. It's the idea that in fantasy, things are somewhat magical because in the end, things typically work out. The Hobbit dude like throws the ring in the thing and like it kills off Sauron and everybody's freed from the one ring and yada, yada, yada. Whereas in sci-fi, things tend to go wrong. Technology is too powerful. So it's like Terminator 2, and it's this weird shape-changing guy walking after you and he's trying to kill off a little kid and Arnold Schwarzenegger robot, right? And so because dystopia is a subset usually of science fiction, the book, in my mind, is like a blues song instead of, to mix metaphors, versus like a pop song. So that there's a certain sort of overriding sadness. It's saying, okay, this is a jacked up society because these technological innovations is going to turn out bad. But I didn't want it to be a book where it's only about sad. I didn't want to like fetishize the sadness and darkness. Mm-hmm. And so therefore I made a point to create these characters in Minty and Nigel, where, even though Nigel is the object of his dad's, bad actions.
Yeah.
He knows himself. And then he has Minty, who was like basically a freedom fighter. I mean, she was 10 years older. She'd be like on a picket line somewhere, with her fist raised up, shoving a cop back who's trying to attack somebody. She'd be right there doing those things. So to me, those two characters were in the best frame of mind to imagine a better future. And so, it's funny, I saw an article on Facebook like last week about 19 Black families bought up this small town. I think it's somewhere in Georgia or Tennessee, and they're gonna just take it over and I think rename it. It's gonna be like their town. Now, those kinds of projects were historically done a long time ago. The original Rosewood was an example of that. Tulsa had its own Black area. We know about that from Watchmen, right? And other research. So it's complicated in that you say, well, how can people who are being oppressed over centuries actually have a full life? And the hard choice is, well, you can integrate, which is just like, well, you're just going to deal with it because you're going to encounter people who just don't like you all the time. You can't get around that. Or you can say, well, we can have a community for ourselves. And in that community, we'll set our own rules, our own expectations. And we'll make sure that, again, that word care, we're going to care for one another. We're not going to allow capitalism and white supremacy to be the two guiding forces. The guiding forces will be love and protection and seeing each other as human in the most basic way, whatever that means. And so when I envisioned New Rosewood, I kept thinking that's all that really is. And so even though these are characters who are not the two lead characters,
yeah,
it's a little bit like that really old film Casablanca, where you have Rick and I think her name was Elsa, and they're this sort of star-crossed lovers who can't quite connect because of the circumstances. Mm-hmm. But in the background, you have these two side characters who do escape North Africa in love, and it's implied that they're going to get married and have a happy life somewhere else in the world. So in a lot of ways for me, Nigel and Minty are like those characters. They get to live their life the best way in this jacked up reality.
Mm-hmm. And you know, just to sort of pivot back to the previous discussion we had, I love also, again, that, you know, we see Nigel and Araminta find this sort of new liberation in the rural South, leaving the urban South, going to the rural South, and finding that divestment from white supremacy and capitalism is possible, and making new beginnings is possible in a rural space.
Hilary, can I say, you just made me think about something I had not thought of before.
Mm-hmm.
What they're doing is not that much different. In fact, it's just like the opposite of all these gated communities that are almost exclusively white. And we've had throughout our history this long legacy of restrictive covenants, where in the neighborhood's documents, they'll say, you know, anybody can live here except for Black folks or Jewish folks or maybe some gay people. And so anybody who says that what Nigel and Araminta and the others do is so radical, it's not that radical. I mean, even around here right now, there's some communities that are basically gated communities. So we have to be careful. We have to be careful about how we think about people. People want a sense of safety and a sense of wholeness, and that's what these characters are doing, which is what most of us want. Yeah.
Most of us do want it, but a lot of us aren't, you know, willing to go, willing to leave the system that is also killing us. And so thinking about this, how systems can make a person unwell, I want to pivot to back to the narrator and addiction within the novel. The narrator really, really struggles with addiction, substance abuse issues. In particular, he is addicted to these types of pills that are nicknamed plums. And at one point, after his wife Penny is killed by a police officer running over her, he overdoses on a particularly potent type of plum and actually dies. Like, they revive him, but he actually died. And you know, throughout the novel, he's just using these plums to sort of get through life, and it's really sad to watch, honestly. But this is also, we know, a thing that a lot of people live with, addiction. And so I'm wondering why you did decide to feature addiction so prominently as part of the narrator's, as a major part of the narrator's characterization, but also what do you see as the connection sort of between illness, addiction, and dystopia within the story and generally?
Yeah, you know, I think for me, it is very personal. I can tell you that addiction has been a problem, a multi-generational problem in my family, and not just addiction, but also like mental health problems. I have an uncle who's schizophrenic, for example. I have other people in my family who are bipolar and have other issues. And of course, we're all Black, right? So I can see in a lot of ways how there's an interplay between those things. How if you're an intelligent young Black person and you see how society wants to limit you, you kind of think, well, how can I let that not hurt me so bad? And so you go, well, just drink or just take some pills. And I think that for this character in this book, there is a true north compass within all of us. Whatever you want to call it, whether it's the spirit of God, whether it's the way you were raised, whether it's just some inchoate thing, you know what's right and wrong. And I think that this narrator, he kind of recognizes that, for lack of a better word, he's screwed, but he's made this choice that he knows is going to be hurtful all around. And so as a result of that, he's taking these pills in order to like just numb the pain. But then on top of that, the pills themselves are hallucinogenic. So he's seeing things that are not there all the time.
Yeah.
And we know that often when Black folks say, hey, this thing happened, you know, the police came out of nowhere and like just shot, you know, my cousin, right? Some will say, that's not what happened. You didn't see that. So they're acting as if we're like hallucinating. And so in a strange way, the plums themselves are almost a stand-in for the Black experience. Yeah, you yourself didn't do anything at all. But that police thought, just say you're Michael Brown. Michael Brown was like 5'9", 180 pounds. The cop said he's like 6'4", 300 pounds. He's the Hulk, so you had to shoot him. So what is reality is in debate in the conversation. And it's one of the things that we see more and more with disinformation campaigns and turning on Fox News versus turning on CNN. And so the plums is kind of a stand-in for all of that stuff. How do you deal with pain? How do you try to see what's really there? How do you, create a narrative that is a true narrative? And so it's a part of all that in the story.
How do you see what's really there? And I think that's so important within the context of the story, because the narrator is also married to a person who doesn't always see what he sees. He talks about Penny thinking he just sees monsters everywhere. And of course, we know how tragically that relationship ends, because right after they have that huge argument, and rightfully so, that Penny is upset that he's continuing to bleach Nigel after he told her that he wouldn't do that anymore. They get into this argument, and she outright says, do you really think that this could happen just because, people might think he's Black? The chances of this happening to our son are super, super low. We don't live in the Tico, yada, yada, yada. And Penny is a very well-meaning character. Throughout the story, it is very much naturally, I think, sort of the natural instinct to align with what Penny is saying before you think about what the narrator is doing. But then as she's walking out into the street, the police officer hits her with his car, and the narrator goes to check on her, and the police officer holds a gun to him. So he can't even hold his wife while she's, dying. He can't hold her in his arms while she dies. Yep. And so seeing all of that play out just really made me think, and this is probably going to have to be our last question, if not our second to last question, because I know time is sort of coming to a close soon. But what did you want to reveal to readers through Penny and the narrator's relationship? And what do you think about this idea of romantic love influence or relationship to dystopia?
Well, I think you're going to love who you're going to love. And I think that in particular, in the dystopian world, love is even more important because things are just so bad. You can't find safety in many places. So like in Orwell's, 1984, he thinks he finds this person he's in love with, and she is like a spy the entire time, which is what makes it a devastating book. In my book, I thought with Penny, she is well-meaning, and she is a good person, and she is a good mother. And yet she has the same blind spots that most people who are not Black have about the Black experience in America, which is to say, I sort of think of her like in that old movie Ghost, starring Patrick Swayze, Demi Moore, and Whoopi Goldberg, where at one point late in the film, these demons come out of the ground to go chase the other evil guy out and bring him to hell. Nobody can see that except for the other ghost. And I feel like sometimes that's what racism is like. Penny can't see the demons that are just everywhere, all around, constantly. The narrator can see those ghosts, and Nigel can see those ghosts, and the Minty can see the ghosts, but she can't see it. And I thought that it's one of the great tragedies is that often white people think that they're not being affected by racism. We have Heather Heyer, for example, who was run over in Charlottesville. Now, I wrote my book before she was killed in that moment, but all of our lives are being degraded by this. I can imagine an alternate reality in which we solved the problem of white supremacy in America 100 years ago. And we now have jetpacks and teleportation devices. We've cured cancer, and the schools are all free. And yet, because of this internal fight amongst ourselves as Americans, we've held ourselves back. And so what it means that you as a white person will die as a result of it, or you just have less money in your bank account. To me, that's what's actually happening to us. And we don't see that because we just want to assume that, race problems is just for Black folks. And I think she represents that complexity in a lot of ways.
And the complexity is key.
Yep.
So this will probably be our last question. And this is from the audience. It says, have you begun work on another novel? And can you say anything about that?
Yeah, so here at the house, I am actually wrapping up my short story collection, which will come out next year in August. It's going to be called The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You. And it is the work of about 10 years. It is all set in New Orleans, except for one story. The characters, all the leads, they're all Black, except for one character who I think thinks he's white, but that's a whole other story. And the newest stories in there, including my first novella, they're all like Black women leads or non-binary characters or queer characters. So I wanted to like try to show New Orleans in its complexity, because we just haven't had it. New Orleans is a very old city, and yet we have not had short story collections by Black people be written out of that city. And my next novel could be a few different things. I've been toying with different ideas. Like one idea involves a Black character who we meet in 1619, but can't die. And so we follow them for the next 400 years and see what happens to them, which is basically what happens in Orlando by Virginia Woolf. So I might do that. I'm also considering a story. I won't say too much about it. I usually just like let the cat out of the bag, but I like started like just last week. I think this is a story about a Black woman from New Orleans who inherits some property in Mississippi and has to figure out how to receive it, because the property is so valuable that people are like, wait, reparations? No, we don't allow that. And so it's like this big battle over whether she's entitled to the property or not. So I'm thinking about that too, but we'll see where it goes.
Sounds good. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed this convo, and I really enjoyed the audience questions as well.
Great questions.
Again, thank you so much. And thank you to the Center for the Study of Southern Culture for giving us the space to hash it out again. And yeah, it's been great. I'll turn it over to Dr. McKee though.
I'm an unwelcome intrusion into this conversation because you guys, this is really wonderful, really thoughtful, really handled with a great deal of care. So thanks to you both. We look forward to having you on campus this year, Maurice and Hilary. I hope that I get to see you in person soon.
Same.
Come back to this space next week, and we will have Jimmy Thomas talking about his MFA project about Lebanese Mississippians. Next week and on and on. We've got lots of great programming this semester, and we'll look forward to seeing you here. Thanks.